In 1892, the World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago. The official story: 27 million visitors toured 200 temporary buildings constructed in under 3 years by a workforce that peaked at 10,000. The structures covered 690 acres. But the Chicago Tribune reported something that doesn't align cleanly with temporary construction. The chief architect noted that foundation work alone required moving 120 million pounds of material before a single decorative element went up. The exposition closed in 1893. Most buildings were demolished by 1894. That's the accepted timeline. But across American cities in the late 1800s, census records show populations of 50,000 to 200,000 living in urban centers featuring courthouses, railway stations, libraries, and opera houses scaled for populations 5 to 10 times larger. The buildings still stand. The discrepancy sits in the archives. No mystery. No hidden explanation. Just a mismatch in the numbers that keeps appearing when you look at infrastructure and population data from the same decade. This pattern shows up across continents. It's not limited to America. It's not restricted to one architectural style or one type of structure. It repeats. Before we go further, a necessary note. This is not a historical documentary claiming to prove a lost civilization or suppressed narrative. This is an exploration of architectural patterns, census data, and infrastructure timelines that exist in public records but are rarely examined together. Everything presented here is verifiable. Nothing here is fabrication. The interpretation is open. Now back to the pattern. In 1850, San Francisco's population was 25,000. By 1906, before the earthquake, the city had ornate municipal buildings, a central library, multiple theaters, and a cable car system serving 600,000 daily trips. The infrastructure was already in place when the population caught up. City planning documents from the 1870s show proposals for civic buildings designed with capacity assumptions that wouldn't be met for another 30 years. The same thing happened in Melbourne. In 1850, the population was under 30,000. By 1880, the city had completed a central railway station, government buildings, and exhibition halls built to accommodate gatherings of 50,000 people or more. The population in 1880 was around 280,000, but the infrastructure reflected plans for twice that. This isn't unusual in isolation. Cities often build ahead of projected growth. But the scale and consistency across unrelated regions create friction. Take the Royal Exhibition Building in Melbourne. Completed in 1880, it was designed to host up to 40,000 visitors simultaneously. The entire city's population at the time was 280,000. That's one building designed for roughly 14% of the city's total population to gather at once. The foundation work alone took 2 years. The dome structure required engineering specifications typically reserved for permanent civic monuments, not exhibition spaces. It hosted the first Australian Parliament in 1901, so it wasn't temporary. In the United States, the same decade saw nearly identical patterns. The 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia constructed over 200 buildings on 285 acres in under 2 years. Official records state 10 million people visited over 6 months. The city's population in 1876 was 817,000. The main exhibition building measured 1,880 feet long and 464 feet wide, covering over 20 acres under a single roof. It was the largest building in the world at the time. It was torn down in 1881. The larger question isn't whether cities could build large structures quickly. They demonstrably could. The friction comes from capacity versus usage. The buildings were consistently larger, more ornate, and more structurally advanced than the populations they served required. And then there's the administrative capacity. In 1860, the U.S. federal government employed roughly 40,000 people nationwide. By 1870, after the Civil War, that number had grown to about 53,000. During that same period, major cities built municipal offices, courthouses, and state buildings with administrative wings designed to house workforces in the thousands. The Dakota Territory, which had a population of 4,837 in 1860, began construction on a territorial capital building in 1883, before statehood, before a tax base large enough to sustain it, and while the population was still under 100,000. The building seated a legislative body of 75. So why design administrative space for 10 times that capacity? Census records and architectural plans don't match. Not occasionally. Consistently. In Leeds, England, the town hall was completed in 1858. The city's population was 172,000. The building featured a main hall designed for civic gatherings of 7,000 people. That's over 4% of the city's entire population in a single room. The organ installed in the hall had 6,500 pipes and remains one of the largest in Europe. The cost was £122,000, equivalent to roughly £15 million today. For a mid-sized industrial city. The justification at the time was civic pride and future growth. But future growth doesn't explain the uniformity. It doesn't explain why the same pattern appears in cities that never reach the projected populations, or why the architectural style and scale remain nearly identical across regions with no direct communication or shared planning bodies. You see it in the train stations. St. Pancras in London, completed in 1868, was built to handle traffic volumes that wouldn't materialize until the 1920s. The train shed roof spanned 240 feet without internal supports, an engineering achievement that required iron framework designs typically reserved for bridges or warships. The station served a city of 3 million, but its capacity reflected infrastructure for 10 million. Grand Central Depot in New York, completed in 1871, had a similar overcapacity. The city's population was 1.5 million. The station was designed to process 15,000 passengers per hour. So the question isn't about capability. It's about intention. And intention requires either foresight or inheritance. The Erie Canal provides a useful anchor point. Construction began in 1817. The canal stretched 363 miles from Albany to Buffalo, connecting the Hudson River to Lake Great Lakes. It required 83 locks, 18 aqueducts, and the removal of millions of cubic yards of earth. The workforce never exceeded 9,000 men at any given time. Most were Irish immigrants using hand tools, black powder, and horse-drawn equipment. The canal opened in 1825. New York State's population in 1820 was 1.4 million. The canal's capacity from the start could handle freight volumes that wouldn't be reached until the 1850s. The locks were built wider than the boats in use at the time. The aqueducts were over-engineered, featuring stonework and arches designed for loads far exceeding initial traffic projections. DeWitt Clinton, the governor who championed the project, called it a work more stupendous, more magnificent and more beneficial than has hitherto been achieved by the human race. That's the language used in 1825. But here's the friction. The Erie Canal wasn't the first. It was the largest in the United States, but canal systems had already been built in England, France, and the Netherlands over the previous century. The engineering principles weren't new. The scale was. And the scale didn't match the population it served. The same pattern appears in the rail networks. In 1850, the United States had 9,000 miles of railroad track. By 1860, that had grown to 30,000 miles. By 1870, it was 53,000 miles. The expansion happened during a decade marked by the Civil War, which drained labor, resources, and capital. Yet the rail network expanded. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, connected Omaha to Sacramento. The population density along most of the route was under 1 person per square mile. The rail line passed through territories that wouldn't achieve statehood for another 20 years. The justification was future settlement and freight transport, but the infrastructure preceded the economic activity it was meant to serve. That's standard pioneering development. Except the rail lines were built to mainline standards, graded roadbeds, standardized track gauge, bridges designed for heavy locomotives. These weren't temporary routes. They were permanent installations built to specifications that assumed high-frequency, high-capacity usage. Before the demand existed. In Britain the same thing happened earlier. The London and Birmingham Railway, completed in 1838, was designed to handle traffic volumes that wouldn't emerge until the 1860s. The line featured viaducts, tunnels, and cuttings engineered for double-track capacity from the beginning. Kilsby Tunnel alone required 5 years of construction and cost £300,000, equivalent to over £30 million today. The railway company went into debt before the line became profitable. But the infrastructure remained. Now shift to grain storage. In the 1870s, American grain elevators began appearing in cities like Chicago, Minneapolis, and Buffalo. These weren't small warehouses. The Darts elevator in Buffalo, completed in 1870, could store 750,000 bushels of grain. Chicago's elevators by 1880 had a combined capacity of 25 million bushels. The U.S. wheat harvest in 1870 was 235 million bushels. So Chicago alone had storage capacity for over 10% of the national harvest. That seems excessive until you consider that the capacity matched infrastructure, rail lines, port facilities, and processing mills, that all scaled simultaneously. The elevators didn't stand alone. They were part of a coordinated system that appeared to anticipate demand rather than respond to it. And then there's electrical infrastructure. Thomas Edison's Pearl Street Station opened in New York in 1882. It powered 400 lamps in a 1 square mile area of Lower Manhattan. Within 3 years, the station had expanded to power 10,000 lamps. By 1890, there were dozens of power stations across American cities, but the grid infrastructure, underground conduits, substations, distribution panels, was built to handle loads far exceeding initial usage. The same thing happened with water systems. The Croton Aqueduct in New York, completed in 1842, delivered 90 million gallons of water per day to a city with a population of 300,000. That's 300 gallons per person per day, 3 times the typical per capita usage at the time. The aqueduct was built for a population of over 1 million. It took until 1870 for the city to grow into that capacity. So the question compounds: why build systems that exceed demand by decades? One answer is municipal ambition. Cities competed for prestige, investment, and population growth. Overbuilding signaled confidence. It attracted capital. It justified bond issuances and land speculation. But that explanation works for one city. Maybe two. It doesn't explain the uniformity across continents. Consider the administrative buildings again. The U.S. Pension Bureau building in Washington, D.C., completed in 1887, was designed to house 1,500 clerks processing pension claims for Civil War veterans. The Great Hall inside measured 316 feet by 116 feet with a ceiling height of 159 feet. The building featured 15.5 million bricks and used more than 4 million gallons of water during construction to set the mortar. For an administrative office. The same decade saw similar structures in London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna. The administrative architecture scaled independently of population. It reflected capacity assumptions that consistently exceeded documented need. And then there's the styling. Beaux-Arts, Neoclassical, Second Empire. The architectural movements of the late 1800s shared common elements. Grand facades, symmetrical layouts, domed central halls, and extensive use of stone or brick. These weren't vernacular styles that evolved regionally. They were formal systems taught in academies, codified in pattern books, and implemented across disconnected cities with remarkable consistency. The École des Beaux-Arts in Paris trained architects from across Europe and the Americas. But the consistency goes deeper than shared education. The buildings themselves, scale, proportion, material choice, align across regions that had minimal direct contact. Whether this reflects inheritance, shared planning, or convergent development is unclear. But the alignment is measurable. The infrastructure before demand pattern isn't limited to one type of system. It shows up in canals, railways, grain storage, electrical grids, water systems, and administrative buildings. Each one, taken individually, can be explained by optimism, ambition, or forward planning. But when they all appear together in the same time frame across unconnected regions, the explanation starts to stretch. Something was being built toward. Not discovered. Not planned in isolation. Built toward. The word Tartaria appears on European maps from the 15th through 19th centuries. It wasn't a mystery. It was a geographic designation for the vast region stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing parts of modern-day Russia, Mongolia, and Central Asia. The term derives from Tatar, referring to Turkic and Mongol peoples who inhabited the region. Cartographers used it the way they used Arabia or Scandinavia, as a broad regional label, not a unified political entity. By the mid-1800s, as the Russian Empire expanded and Western knowledge of Asian geography improved, the term fell out of use. It disappeared from maps not because something was hidden, but because more precise terminology replaced it. That's the historical record. The modern reinterpretation began in online communities in the early 2010s. Researchers examining architectural anomalies, census discrepancies, and infrastructure timelines began using Tartaria as shorthand for a hypothesis that the buildings and systems from the 1800s weren't built by the civilizations credited in official records, but inherited from an earlier, more advanced society that experienced a catastrophic collapse. The hypothesis isn't academically supported, but it emerged from observable patterns. Three interpretations exist for the infrastructure before demand phenomenon. The first, standard historical explanation. Cities in the 1800s experienced rapid industrialization, capital accumulation, and technological advancement. Municipal governments, driven by competition and speculation, invested in oversized infrastructure to attract settlers, businesses, and investment. The overcapacity was intentional. It was a bet on future growth. Sometimes the bet paid off. Sometimes it didn't. The buildings that remain are survivorship bias. We remember the grand structures, not the failed projects. This explanation accounts for individual cases but struggles with the uniformity and scale across disconnected regions. The second, coordinated development. A less discussed aspect of 19th century history is the degree of international cooperation among engineers, architects, and planners. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869, involved French engineers, Egyptian labor, and British financing. The transcontinental telegraph system, completed in 1866, required coordination across multiple nations. The World's Fairs and international exhibitions created networks of architects and engineers who shared plans, techniques, and designs. Under this model, the consistency isn't coincidence. It's collaboration. The buildings look similar because the same people designed them or trained under the same systems. The overcapacity reflects shared assumptions about urbanization, population growth, and industrial expansion that were international in scope. This explanation accounts for stylistic uniformity but doesn't fully address why the infrastructure consistently preceded demand by decades. The third, inheritance model. This suggests that at least some of the infrastructure attributed to 19th century construction was not built from scratch, but repurposed, expanded, or rebuilt on foundations that already existed. Under this interpretation, the construction timelines in official records refer to renovation, not original construction. The overcapacity isn't planning for the future. It's scaling to match infrastructure that was already there. This model has no mainstream academic support, but it offers an explanation for the scale, the timeline compression, and the cross-regional consistency that the other two models struggle with. All three can coexist. Cities absolutely built new infrastructure in the 1800s. International cooperation certainly influenced design and planning. And some buildings may have incorporated older foundations or been built atop previous structures. The question is proportion. Return to 1816 for a moment. That year is known as the year without a summer. The eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia the previous year sent ash into the atmosphere, lowering global temperatures and causing widespread crop failures. In Europe and North America, snow fell in June. Harvests collapsed. Famine spread. Population records from 1816 to 1820 show significant mortality spikes in certain regions, but the records themselves are incomplete. Census data from this period is inconsistent, particularly in rural areas and territories that hadn't yet formalized administrative structures. What's notable isn't the event itself. Volcanic winters are well documented. What's notable is the timing. By 1820, the infrastructure boom had begun. The Erie Canal started in 1817. Major civic building projects launched across Europe and the United States throughout the 1820s. The population data from that decade shows growth, but the infrastructure scales beyond the documented growth. Some researchers suggest 1816 represents a reset point, a moment after which existing infrastructure was repopulated rather than newly built. That's speculative, but the timing creates space for the question. Here's what's not speculative. The buildings exist. The census records exist. The timelines exist. The capacity mismatches are measurable. Whether those mismatches reflect ambition, collaboration, or inheritance is interpretive. The evidence doesn't demand one conclusion. It invites examination. When you walk through a 19th century train station or stand inside a municipal building from the 1880s, the scale registers physically. The ceilings, the stonework, the engineering, it's not subtle. These structures were built to last centuries and accommodate populations far larger than the ones present when construction finished. That could be vision. That could be coordination. That could be something else. The infrastructure remains. The records remain. The patterns remain. What remains open is how we interpret the relationship between them. This isn't about proving a lost civilization or claiming deliberate erasure. It's about recognizing that the physical evidence and the documentary record don't align as cleanly as we often assume. The gaps are real. The questions are legitimate. And the answers are not yet settled. The buildings will outlast the debate.